Sure. Um, so yeah, this is a live Q&A session. Here I am again in this lovely parking lot. I'm going to start today with some parked questions, questions that were left on the channel that were maybe a little bit too complex to answer in a typed out response. Because sometimes I feel like a crazy person typing out these long comments on the internet, right? Like, what am I, a cave dwelling ne'er-do-well? I don't know. So I thought I would instead gather some of those questions and answer them here as a way to get this thing rolling. And then if there are other questions that you guys want to drop in the chat, please drop them in the chat and we'll go from there. We'll see what I can get to in the time I have, which is maybe about 20-25 minutes. So welcome if you're just joining us. I'm going to start with a question that was left on the channel by user Atan Varno Alda. The question is, can you please recommend a good, modern, up-to-date book about basic color theory with correct charts and explanations? So I actually grabbed a few books on my way out of the house so that I could share them with you. So let's take a look at some of those. One I always recommend is James Gurney's book, Color and Light. This was the book that a few years ago got me on my journey, right? Like, this is where the whole color nerd thing began, because he talks about CMY versus red, yellow, blue. He talks about how it's not just about which primary paints you're mixing with, but actually all that it implies. That if your color wheel is built around red, yellow, and blue, it's actually like out of whack, and the spacing between hues is wrong. So that kind of got me started on all this research and everything. So I think this is a great like gateway drug to the deep end of the pool with color theory. He's also got just a lot of really practical for painters advice about how to model light and how to do different cool contrast effects, etc., etc. So that's always been one of my top recommendations, James Gurney's Color and Light. Hello, a couple of folks popped into the chat. I'm not ignoring you. How are you? This is another one. I just picked this up recently. This is if you're like a teacher and you're looking for new ideas for working with color in a design classroom. The Color Course Book by Roy Osborne. Again, this guy's like science-based. He's got a lot of new kind of takes on the classic simultaneous contrast, like all the classic color type exercises that I think is excellent. I'm still actually reading through this and thinking about ways to use it in my classroom. So that's one I recommend. If you're looking for something a little bit more beginner friendly, if you're a painter, watercolor, oil, acrylic, I highly recommend this book by Hilary Page. It's called Color Right from the Start. I don't know if it's still in print, but you can find it used. It's from the 90s, and it's kind of unassuming. It looks like your average color theory book that's going to have all the wrong red, yellow, blue type information in it, but it's not. She's got really good science behind everything she's saying. She talks a little bit about how light scatters through pigments and like how pigment mixing works, and basically everything that I've seen in here I think is pretty valid. She's got, for example, cadmium yellow across from ultramarine blue instead of across from violet, and that's how you know that she's got her hues perceptually spaced rather than a red, yellow, blue model. So this is Hilary Page's Color Right from the Start. Great, science-based, practical, good for beginners. So that's another book recommendation. I'm going to give you one more recommendation. I don't have the book with me. It's kind of heavy. I didn't grab it on my way out of the house, but it's Todd Casey's book. Again, if you're a painter, the Oil Painter's Handbook. He gives a very complete discussion of all different ways of looking at color. He looks at the traditional way as well as the science-based way. He kind of puts them all on the table and lets you decide what makes sense for you, which I think is a good approach. The only part of the book that I kind of hope he maybe updates in a future edition is the section on color harmony, because it's very traditional. But all the stuff about how light works, how pigment mixing works, all of that stuff is great in that book, the Oil Painter's Color Handbook. Great book. One final recommendation, if you're just looking for a general book about color theory ideas and concepts, it's called Universal Principles of Color. It's edited by a couple people I know. And I think the subtitle is like 100 Key Concepts About Color. You can find that book as well as Todd Casey's book on my bookshop page, which is if you go to my Linktree Color Nerd, my bookshop page has a few different kind of in-print things that I recommend, and then a few other random things. So anyway, that was the first question, was, are there books I recommend? Let me say hello to the folks who are in the chat. I see 5 people hanging in there. I appreciate you hanging out with me as I do this. I know a lot of people said, you know, they'd like to see me do more live Q&As and to kind of post the recordings. So even if only a few people hang out and ask questions, I'm totally cool with that, because I'll post this and maybe other people will get some use out of it afterwards. I think part of the big point here is community building. If you found my videos on YouTube, it's probably because you're looking for answers about color and how color works and color theory in general. And so it's important to build community and to find other people who are trying things and looking for the same answers. So let's look at a couple other questions from the past week or so. Another user, Palomino X64, asks, why does watercolor lose chroma as it dries? This is a great question, and that's why I plucked it out, because I thought it really deserved an in-depth response. Why does watercolor lose chroma as it dries? If you've ever played with watercolor, you kind of experience this. You get, like, you know, quinacridone pink or quinacridone magenta, and you get a nice tint by watering it down, and it looks very vibrant, but then as soon as it dries, it kind of dulls itself. This happens with a lot of pigments, especially transparent pigments. And the reason is that when it is suspended in water, what happens is it acts more like a transparent filter, like you are putting a gel in front of a light in the theater. The pigment particles being suspended in water are kind of allowed to interact with light coming into the water and hitting it from more sides. So there's kind of more selectivity of reflection happening with the pigment particle than if it was just kind of a mass on the paper. So that's one part of it. But the major part of it is the total internal reflection aspect of it, because when the light hits the water, some of that light kind of bounces around inside the water and never escapes, right? And so this is actually why sometimes when you mix two colors in a wet pigment, a wet vehicle, a wet medium, it kind of darkens, especially if they're transparent pigments, because more light is kind of getting trapped in there. But then as the water evaporates and the pigment settles down on the paper, what you're going to see is more of an optical mix rather than a subtractive mix. What does that mean? That means all the particles, as they come to rest, they're all kind of hanging out next to each other, instead of the light kind of filtering through and getting subtracted as it would through a filter, which is what's happening when they're in water. So you're switching from a more transparent and a more subtractive type of color mixing happening. As it dries and the water goes out and it flattens on the page, it becomes more of an optical mixing situation. And optical mixing means everything's going to average, which means opposite colors are going to kind of more neutralize and things are going to gray out, right? So that's kind of a quick and dirty explanation of why that happens. Why does watercolor dull as it dries? Because essentially, this is something that Bruce McAvoy has argued, watercolor is not a transparent medium. People think it is, but once it settles on the page, it's just piles of pigment particles kind of bound to the page, and it's going to behave like opaque layers of crumbs, and it's going to interact with light in that way. So essentially it becomes more opaque, and it mixes as opaque objects do, like if you're just mixing sand together when it's dry. So there you go. The question was, why does watercolor lose chroma as it dries? I think I saw a couple comments in the chat, but they disappeared on me, and I'm going to try to pull them up. Let me see where this is here. I'm still learning how this works, by the way. So welcome if you're just joining us. This is just a general Q&A on color theory. My whole channel, the Color Nerd channel, is about color theory. And I got a lot of fascinating questions in the comments on my videos. And so I kind of just thought I would try to address some of them here. And then if time allows, and if I can kind of see the comments as they pop up, I'll try to also address some live questions. I'm looking on the screen for anywhere where I can open the chat, and I am not seeing it. Here we go. Okay, so Nicole Frost says, I teach people how to hand dye yarn and fibers for hand spinning. YouTube showed me one of your videos and I've learned, and then the rest is getting cut off. I don't know what's wrong with my settings here. I've learned so much from you. My classes have greatly benefited from your color theory. That warms my heart. Thank you so much for that wonderful comment. Um, and then Jacob Swanger says, do you tend to use phthalo blue for the closest thing to your primary cyan? I would say in a lot of cases, yes. Phthalo blue, even though in hue it's more blue than cyan, what happens when you tint it or when you just dilute it with medium or with water or whatever medium you're using, phthalo blue shifts towards cyan, right? As it leaves its mass tone and gets into its undertone, it's greener. So it shifts towards cyan and it behaves like a cyan. So as you're mixing it with things, it will behave as a cyan does. I've been recently experimenting with PB16 phthalo turquoise, Holbein, or no, is it? No, it's Old Holland. Old Holland has it as Caribbean blue. So I've been experimenting with that. And I like it. It is a slight bit greener, but its tinting strength is a little weaker. But yeah, phthalo blue is kind of the best option in general for a primary cyan. Thank you for the question. I'm going to jump to another parked question. This is one that was left on the channel by It's Peach. The question is, how can we use the information, and this is in regards to character first color harmony from my video about a week ago, how can we use the information practically? Is there a method or technique to achieve matching character when painting using pigments? So I'm going to start by answering that in kind of an annoying way, that you might not necessarily need to match character. Character is talking about a range within a color plane or a hue plane. So if I have vivid red, pale red, muted red, dark red, what's my muted red? That's a range. It's more about how I'm going to perceive it in the context. So it might be a little more vivid, a little less vivid than another color, but if it feels like it doesn't match, just eyeball it until it lower its chroma by adding a gray of the same lightness until it feels like it is talking the same language as a muted color of a different hue. So that's not a super helpful answer, but that's kind of the easy answer, is that you don't necessarily have to match character, like get the same chroma reading on different characters with a spectrometer or something. You just have to get them perceptually in your perception of what you're looking at to be sort of speaking the same vibe, if that makes sense. One might be paler than the other, but if you're going for pale, as long as they are both in the pale neighborhood, you'll know the difference between a vivid yellow and a pale yellow. And if something is too vivid, it'll stand out. If something is too dark, it'll stand out, and you adjust as you go. So that's kind of a general answer to that. How do you use that information of harmonizing by matching character, right? Like all of my colors should be muted if I'm trying to communicate a certain softness or a certain whatever emotion I'm trying to get across with that color scheme. Should I mute them all the same amount? Is that even possible? Is that something worth trying to achieve? I don't know. But if they're all muted and you've graded them all somewhat, it'll work, I think is the answer. Here's another question from Sore Purpose, who's left a few questions on the channel recently. Would be interested more in these character palettes. Is the dark from adding black with these hue planes, as digital and pigments can give different results? So I'm going to try to interpret that question because I don't know if I 100% understand it. But I think what it's saying is, if you're looking at the dark character of a color, does that just mean mixing black? If you mix a pigment with black, you may or may not know this as an artist, it'll sort of gray out. Usually it'll gray out faster than it darkens. And that might not be what you want, right? And this is one reason that traditionally art teachers have said don't shade with black, because it does muddy things. And that's especially true if you're using high value colors. So if you try to darken like a high value green or yellow or orange with black, there's more room. There's more of a lightness scale that it has to go down because it's a high value. And so there's more room for it to lose chroma as you're darkening it with black, and you end up unsatisfied with the result. So if you darken a high value color with a chromatic dark, right? Like, I don't know, darken yellow with green gold, which is essentially like a lemon yellow in hue, but dark and saturated. It's a great pigment, PY129, green gold, or copper azo green gold. I use that to darken my yellows because it keeps them saturated as it darkens them. And so it's still dark, but it's not dull because I haven't mixed it with black. So that's kind of all like context for this question, which is saying I want to know more about like if I'm trying to achieve these character-driven palettes, what does it mean if I'm trying to get dark, right? Can I just mix black with everything? Maybe not. Maybe not. And in fact, you might want to go more like deep or saturated, depending on, you know, what you're trying to do. Deep, I think, is a good character name to distinguish from dark. Deep means dark but saturated, and then dark usually means dark and somewhat unsaturated. So it depends what you're going for. And, you know, if you want deep, if you want dark but saturated, you can't mix with black. You've got to use dark saturated pigments. And if you're a digital artist, that just means make sure your saturation's all the way up as you lower your brightness. Hello to a couple of new people who popped in. And so I have like one or two more questions that I pulled out from the channel to answer here. If you guys have other questions you want to throw into the chat, please do. My chat keeps kind of disappearing off the screen, so I'm just checking in here and there. Ghost Type Artist says, hello, amazing videos. They've been of great help. Pleased to hear that. Thanks so much. So yeah, any other questions? I don't know if I've missed one or two. Spin Kitty says, I just got done modeling for an intermediate painting class. Well, awesome, right? Can't get away from art today. All right, so I've got one more question here, which is by Michael Pohoreski. He says, have you investigated Edwin Land's 1964 Retinex color theory? As a computer graphics programmer, it made me rethink the whole RGB and CYM color model. So Retinex isn't something I've really looked at in depth, but for those who might be interested, it's a portmanteau from retina and cortex. And he's basically, his theory in the 60s was like, we can't just be looking at the cone cells in the eye. We've got to look at also what the cortex is doing. We've got to look at how there's kind of like this processing happening of the signal. And his main, I think, this is what I recall, his main thesis or idea is that we're actually parsing out two signals. One is more like, what are we actually seeing with the illumination? Like right now, I've got a very warm yellowish illumination on my face, which is casting a warm glow on everything. And then how does our brain know that things like my face isn't actually yellow? Things aren't actually the color of the illumination. And so in color science, this is related to the idea of color constancy, right? How the illuminant can change, but our eyes have adapted to know that and to not say, why is that rock suddenly purple? It was blue before, right? We know that it hasn't changed color. So his theory was trying to explain why. Again, I'm not super well versed in that theory, but it is something I could look into if we want to see some content on this channel about it. So I'm going to go to the chat. I see a couple comments in here. Jacob says, have you found any good iPad apps that mimic pigment mixing instead of digital mixing? I'm going to recommend to you Brian Dieterle's app. It's called Focal Paint. I think it's out of beta now. I was playing with it in beta a while ago. I think it's out of beta and you can download it on the App Store. But he's got, I think he's kind of homebrewed an algorithm. He's not using Mixbox, but he's using something like it to model actual pigment mixture. And what I love about that app, Focal Paint, is that you can actually edit like the waveform of the color that you're painting with. So what I mean is like, as if it were a real pigment with a spectral reflectance curve, right? Like cobalt blue reflects more of these wavelengths and less of these wavelengths. Like you can model pigments on the fly, and you can even make up like pigments that couldn't possibly exist with like reflectance profiles that are like crazy and zigzaggy and stuff. And I've had a lot of fun playing with that to see what happens when they mix and whether or not it's like modeling something realistic. So Focal Paint, I think, is a great iPad app for digital painting. Kayla Veilleux, I think I'm saying that right, sorry, says, no question, just wanted to say thank you. Thanks for being here, appreciate you. Paolo says, just wanting to thank you for your videos. Thank you for popping in to say hi. Ghost Type Artist says, what about cheat codes? When I have to paint bounce light, I default to a pure gray, slightly lighter than the shadow color. I default to a pure gray, slightly lighter than the shadow color. Or for skin shadows, I use a dark desaturated orange more often than not. I don't know. I'd have to really play around with those two specific ideas to see when they would work and when they would kind of fall down in terms of, is it realistic rendering? But what I tend to do as a cheat code, because I do digital drawing and comics, like cell shading type stuff, My cheat code for shading is to, it's kind of complicated, but I'll walk you through it. Um, I will create um, an adjustment layer, and I think a lot of artists do something similar, but I'll create an adjustment layer that actually inverts the colors. I'll lower the opacity and I'll set it to multiply so that in effect it's shading with the complement. And so that means I'm always going to get something that matches the saturation of what I'm doing. So if I have a saturated orange, it's going to shade it with multiply layer of a saturated blue with the same amount of saturation because I did an inversion of the layer. So because I know that shadows should kind of retain saturation in most cases unless there's bounce light or something. That generally works for me as like a quick cheat for doing shading and having it like look consistent and good. So I don't know if that helps, but that might be something for you to try. What else? See, I've got time for a couple more. Kaburake Studio says, hello, I'm from Brazil. Do you have a favorite printer configuration to print Gamu? I want to know about paper also. Okay, great question. Thanks. So when I do stuff I'm imagining people will print, like the Gamu color slide rule, right? I do those with the fact that every printer is different in mind. So I'm not really aiming for perfect color accuracy because I know that's kind of not achievable when I don't know what the devices are. And it's going to change over time and all that kind of stuff. So there's too many variables, and I kind of just say, the heck with it. You get the idea. It's more about visualizing where things are in relationship to each other than perfect accuracy. So with all of that in mind, I think like I just use the basic color profile in Adobe Illustrator. And I think I put it on like perceptual mode, if that makes sense to you. If you played with those settings, you probably know what I'm talking about. Other than that, I would just say you're going to get the best results printing something like Gamu or my color disc or all these other color resources I've done. You're going to get the best results if you use like a glossy cardstock, because that's not going to absorb the printer ink as much and dull the colors, right? I've gotten the best results that way. I use like a cardstock that's a little bit glossy. So that's what I'd recommend. All right, a couple more questions maybe. Let's see. Speaking of bounce light, says Jacob, how do you know which hue to lean the bounce light toward? It depends what, on the scene, right? So if you're just talking about daylight, there's the sun, which is going to be slightly warm, and then there's the dome of the sky, which is giving you this scattered blue light that fills in shadows. So your bounce light's going to be bluish, kind of, right? If it's coming off of a shadowed surface and kind of re-highlighting someone slightly from the bottom, like it might give you a little bit of a bluish bounce. But in most cases, when we're talking about bounce light, we're talking about like theatrical or cinematic lighting, where you've got like a red light over here and a green light over here and wacky stuff like that. And you just go with the hue of whatever you imagine that light to be. If you're talking about bounce light interreflection coming off of an object, say there's like a bright green ball here next to my head, right? And the light's coming this way, it's bouncing off that green ball, right? You've got to think, what's the color of the illuminant? How is the ball going to affect that? So, right, like if you're doing an adjustment layer for that illuminant, see, maybe color pick what that looks like over the green, and you're going to get like maybe a yellowish green or a slightly less saturated green, and that's going to be the hue of your bounce light, right? So you kind of have to do the math of like, what was the light, what is the surface going to do, and also think about how brighter colors reflect more than duller colors. So like a yellow thing is going to give more bounce light than like a blue thing, which isn't reflecting as much of the spectrum. It's not going to have as much volume of interreflection, if that's helpful, hopefully. Okay. I'm just checking the chat for any other questions here. So Spin Kitty says, the color fidget that you and the Gray Muse made is fantastic. I'm having a lot of fun with it. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. I'm glad you like it. Yeah, I've seen a few people post about it, and the feedback seems good. I mean, I put a lot of thought into the colors, how to make the colors appear the way I wanted to, and we weren't quite sure how it was going to come out, the color fidget, but with the UV printing, they were really able to get the colors kind of how we envisioned them. Yeah, so I'm really pleased with how it came out as well, and I'm glad you are. Awesome. All right, I think I'm just about out of time. Let me just check my clock here. I'm going to finish up. Thank you for hanging out with me in my car in a parking lot, talking color theory. I couldn't be happier. I have loved the interaction on YouTube in recent weeks, and so you're a big part of this, and giving me somebody to talk to while answering these questions has certainly. Oh, there goes my alarm. Has certainly made this like rewarding and fun for me, and I hope to keep going over the next few months and really build community here. So keep your questions coming. I always try to take stock, go through the comments and see if there's any good stuff to engage with, because it's worth engaging with. And if I can help you on your color theory journey, that makes me a happy person. All right, guys, I'm going to shut down. See you soon.